So my name is Ruth Chase. I am a mom, a community member, an artist in residence with Nevada County Arts Council. I'm a multimedia artist whose work engages and activates community bridge building. Here's where Saturday morning question kind of came out of. When I was a student at SFAI, I had a teacher, Carlos Villa, and he said something to the effect of, the best teacher you'll ever have is yourself asking the right questions. And that's what we've been doing here with Saturday morning questions. They're really prompts to storytelling, giving us an opportunity to share our narratives with each other and to get a chance to use community as a resource. So with that, okay, we've got Rick Berry. Hey, I haven't seen you for a while. Rick Berry's a key participant. And Shelby and Ron's participated. And I'd like to say that my husband and daughter are here. It's so great that they're here to support. Jennifer and Sue Hook. Oh, how awesome. So let's see. We did 3 years of belonging and we're still in the third year. The questions are coming to an end. But we used the question to prompt the community. Like I said, it's a bridge building tool. And so the first year we asked, how do we find a sense of belonging through the land? And Rick Berry and Mike Stewart, who's here, were part of that project. Second year was, how do we find a sense of belonging in a rural community? How do women find a sense of belonging in a rural community? And then this year we're asking, what does home mean to you? And of course, there's much more to all of this than just the question, but we start the project with the question. So let's take a look at what happened with belonging.
There's an experience that happened in my life where I went hunting. You know, there was a salmon, there was a deer, there was these animals, and my friend told me the story about, hey, when you take something from the land, you create a void, and you have to fill that void with your respect. But he didn't say define respect. He said, well,
I thought I was an environmentalist. Well, I still am an environmentalist. But I was of the mindset that if you cut one tree, you were doing something wrong. Well, I've learned a lot in my 16 years here. And I realize that the best thing that we can do for this place is to remove a bunch of trees, because there's way more trees here now than there were back under the previous management, which was the Native Americans.
I want to talk about documented bloodlines or genealogy from my daughter. She is 8th generation from around the Gold Rush era. So my daughter Lorena, and that comes to myself, then my mom, Ginger, her father Dutch, his mother Mary, and her mother Mary, and then her father Pamelo. And Pamelo was a junior, so he came from a long line of leaders, and his father was also Pamelo.
Well, the land inspires me every day. If it's just me going out and listening to the sounds, or feeling the texture of the bark, or running my hand across a stump and just realizing that we're only here for an instant, and sharing that with others, this celebration of the environment through art.
Okay, so that was our first year.
Yes, I mean, for me, our program with you was all about finding our sense of place. And of course, at that time, we didn't know that it would extend amazingly into 3 years. And so I sort of look back at that year and I feel that you, Ruth, created this fabulous foundation for us. It was like, okay, let's get real. Here we are in the mountains of the Northern Sierra Nevada and California. Who are we and how do we relate to this earth? So you did such a great job with your amazing participants, some of which are here today. I love it.
Right, and we couldn't have done it without the participants, because the participants were really of the community, and they're the ones that had specific answers to the question we were asking, where I didn't have an answer to that question. I really had to go through the process of understanding that myself. And I did by learning from Rick and Mike and all of the key participants that were in that film.
You know, I learned about belonging before moving to the area. So that was really exciting to discover, and then to come and meet you and Eliza and start participating in the community. And, you know, I have my own music that I need to launch. It's like my deadline is this weekend. And so it's interesting to just have noticed this project. My album is called You Are Where You Belong. So there's an interesting, you know, it's just like a handing the baton in a way of feeling for me.
Yeah. Well, let me know.
Thanks for letting me belong. Thank you.
I love you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We did our very first question in person at Three Forks, and then we moved on to Facebook asking it, which got the most responses. And then in the end, we've done live. And this was our very first question in July of 2017. You can see us there, Shelley and Dee and Julia and Chantel, and there were more people there. How often do you expose yourself to people or groups who are different than you? But that is going to be our question for today. I love that we're ending this cycle of questions with our first question, because this is just as relevant as the first day we asked it.
There are two things we should give our children. One is roots and the other is wings. Roots to stand firmly and wings to soar freely.
Did it work? Yeah. I always felt like I belonged here, but I definitely needed to get out and see the wider world.
But I returned home to be a contributor, to build community and to raise my family surrounded by history and family and friendships. To me, living in a rural community is about connecting to others.
Some of us aren't meant to belong. Some of us have to turn the world upside down and shake the hell out of it until we make our own place in it. Elizabeth Lowell. My name is Shelby. Sometimes I don't feel like I belong at all, but when I make space for myself through creative expression, human connection, and spending time in nature, I feel a sense of belonging and purpose.
I was born on July the 1st, 1919. Do you want to hear the story?
I am here. I am a farmer, I am a rancher, I am an entrepreneur, I am a nature lover. I am a 6th generation Nevada Countian, born connected to the land.
The river called and I answered, waiting in deeply until she and I flowed together. I'm a part of her, being shaped by the wisdom of water. Like the Yuba, I too am strong.
We have been here for generations, countless generations before the gold rush. And we were thought to be extinct for quite a while, but we're not. I know this for a fact because I'm here.
I am Ginny Woods, Anila. I am here. I've delivered hundreds of babies, but only 4 have come from my own body. Moving from Southern California 40 years ago, I delivered babies in homes, teepees, and even under the apple trees of Nevada County.
My name is Isis Indria. I was born in this life to be of service during this great transition. And in that awareness, I dedicate my offerings to co-create a culture of belonging, rooted in a remembrance that we all come from somewhere, and we all have a lineage that carries a living story and living memory.
The starlight within me connects us all, connecting us through story, our voice, as we experience what does it mean to be human. I am a magic maker, a media maven, a musician, an activist, a visionary, a mother, a sister, an aunt, a wife. I am the daughter of a naturalist.
We arrived in 1981 from bustling, trafficky, and mall-laden Southern California. The solid black oaks, red clay dirt, and wildflower-covered meadows welcomed us.
I am here to carry on what she started, a descendant of Johanna, to help reconnect the community with nature, healthy food, and learning from our Indigenous people.
Oh, so yeah, that's it. This is our Saturday morning question. How often do you expose yourself to people or groups that are different than you? So I'm asking myself that question. That's what this is about. This is about the question.
Ruth, if I could just, I have to acknowledge this profoundly sensitive week we've just been through. Not only is it the final week of a particular moment in Belongings, program Belongings Lifestyle, but it's also been a week where in the big wide world, we have been witness, all of us, to the shameful sense of differences that Americans have, but also a lot of beauty where those who seemingly have a majority will stand up and speak for those who are suffering. And of course, I'm speaking about George Floyd and everything that we've been reading about and witnessing this week. But it just feels, with such a question as this, that has to be acknowledged.
I mean, I could speak to it's interesting what you said about age or whatever, because I think about it definitely in my younger years, you know, certainly college and after, I was just hungry for exposure to anything different than I had grown up with. And certainly moving to Grass Valley, I mean, you're isolated anyway geographically,
right?
And you have a home life, you know, and if you're like me, you're working remotely, so they're really the opportunities to engage with anyone, whether they're the same or different than you, are much more limited.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, for somebody who grew up in an extremely diverse community and only had diverse people that I was hanging out with growing up, it's interesting to see how that does change with age and geography. So Kim and Mike, I'm gonna jump over to you because you guys have lived in downtown Nevada City, but now you're in the town of Washington, the little town of Washington, and the culture of the little town of Washington can actually feel very different than the rest of Nevada County, and so you're living immersed, well, and you also grew up there, Mike, but I don't know, do you have anything relevant to that in terms of the big community and then the smaller community within that big community?
Talking to me.
Yeah.
Well, growing up here, you know, we moved full time to the suburbs of Washington when I was 4. And I say it that way because the town of Washington had and still has a reputation that was kind of contrary to the way I was brought up. And so going through grammar school and high school, I used to tell everybody that I lived in the suburbs of Washington. And it was kind of a different mindset. So when we moved into Nevada City, everybody locally here kind of looked at us different, or looked at me differently, because we considered Nevada City and Grass Valley, here we call that big town.
That's so cute that it was called Big Town, wasn't it?
Oh, it still is.
Well, I just wanted to interject an observation, living in a rural and mostly white county. Just an observation that it takes a little more work from people who live here to find diversity and to interact with diversity. It doesn't like automatically happen. It's not around us all the time. So you consciously, if you're concerned about that, you consciously need to take time and some work to interact with people of other diversities and cultures. And I find that, you know, kind of a new challenge of mine is to want to do that more. Because I can't just sit here and wait for diversity to come to me. I got to go seek it out because of where, you know, we live in this community. But interestingly, like Mike said, we moved here full time over 7 years ago. Decided to homeschool the boys because you can see our backyard offered something pretty fantastic. And wonderfully and surprisingly, one of my best friends, who became my best friend when I moved here, was a gentleman named Philip, who just lives down Maybrook Road. And he's an older Black gentleman who ended up tutoring my boys on math, plays a multitude of instruments, and we would have our weekly jam sessions after school. So I was lucky enough to have somebody from his culture introduce some wonderful things right into my little homeschool, right into this tiny little town, right into this tiny little house, frankly. So I feel fortunate for that.
But, you know, I want to just relate a story. My friend, Juan Villarreal, he's in Texas, he's Apache, and we've gone and worked with kids in reservations, one in particular in British Columbia. And I remember there was this really remote village, and it was like, we're going to go and teach these kids. Like they still ride horses and fish. And, you know, the first road went in 1973. But it's the same story of kids. They want everything that all the modern kids want, and they don't want to listen to their elders so much. And so we went there. The thing is, we showed up, and, you know, me, I'm white looking, right? And so, and Juan is not. He looks like Geronimo. And so, but we show up together as like we're working together. But, you know, after hanging out with Juan for a bunch of years and doing things, I'll never know what it's like to be of that color. I just won't, because the way I look. And so it really brought to my awareness that, you know, there's this, people talk about privilege, and I am starting to understand that. And so I'll just never have the perspective that he has at all. And so I'm still learning from that. And, you know, I just wanted to share that.
Rick, thank you so much for everything you've given to the project, and really trusting, both to everybody that's worked on this project, trusting me enough to step forward and be part of something that you had no idea what was going to turn out.
Well, can I just hop in here and comment? Because I was in the Belonging Project in the beginning. And I really, that was really kind of scary for me to come out of my shell, the shelter of my home and what I knew, to and meet up with you, Ruth, and you were so welcoming and open and invited me into discussions. And that was really the first time I felt I belonged in this county is through you.
Well, and there you go, jumping out of the familiar bubble and being around people who are different than you.
Just in lieu of very recent events and the whole George Floyd, you know, situation that's really kind of skyrocketed everybody's, you know, everybody's been sharing these stories and, you know, exposing all of their friends on the internet to, you know, what they perceive and how they feel about this. And it's kind of like forced everybody to look at like the African American community or communities of color and seeing their perspective. And you know, I personally have been trying to do the work to expose myself to their perspective and recognizing my privilege and, you know, almost stepping back from that. And I make sure that for years, I've been listening to podcasts and stories on people's perspectives. And it's really opened my eyes, and I think a lot of other people's eyes right now, to everybody else's. I guess I was just saying that, you know, I've been doing the work to get perspective on what they're feeling, and it's really hard.
So on
You have
that
to do
note,
the work.
on that note, Shelby, would anybody have advice or a thought or an idea about how one gets to know about a culture authentically, or a segment of a community authentically, when you don't necessarily have access to it, or it might feel uncomfortable or challenging?
Sure. I was just going to offer that sometimes I think, one of the things that we don't always talk about is how our society keeps us segregated. And so, even the commercialism of various things makes you more attracted to something that you don't realize is majority white owned, of the things that you are engaged to attend. And so, it does take effort. I think it does take effort to go beyond yourself, no matter where you're coming from, whatever your background is. Our culture kind of keeps people with their own. And so in order to go outside of that, you have to, wonder why you never go into that shop. Why don't you ever go into that shop? Or that cafe or that restaurant, from the way that you don't culturally relate to the imagery or the artistry used to invite you in, So that's
right.
one way.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. Well, another thought that comes to mind is something that I learned growing up in Venice is there was so much violence and chaos available out on the street. And I remember wanting to be in service, like, oh, how do I participate in change making? And I very quickly learned that the first place that I could start, but didn't want to, was within my own family. And that makes me think about our Nisenan. What we've seen this week is no different than what the Nisenan, which is our local tribe here. It's also part of how Belonging started. The Belonging Project really did come out of talking to Shelley Covert and also spending the day on Legacy Ranch with Rob Thompson. But that the Nisenan are here and they're looking for visibility. They have their own very, very tragic experience that happened to them here in this very community that we live. And I don't know, it makes me think about how we start with where we live.
I was born in Washington, D.C., and we had quite a diverse neighborhood. And when we finally moved to California, all of my classmates we moved to San Jose, California. And I've talked to you, Ruth, about this, living in the east side, San Jose, the birthplace of, lowriders. And it was awesome. I had so many different friends. I was the lightest of them all. And even though I am not, I don't know, I've got a lot of American Indian in me, but you can't tell. Anyway, but I loved that I learned how to make lumpia, and I learned how to make empanadas, and go to Easter and make tamales with my next door neighbor's mom, and just all of these different things that they did every day that were different. And I loved that. And I remember one specific thing, 2 doors down, we had a young Chinese family, and the mother was so sweet. And we would play in the backyard, and she would teach me how to say simple things in Chinese. We go home to our own cultures, but there's a whole world out there, and they're all around. Everyone's got a story to tell. So I don't know, that's about it.
Segue to something that I discovered growing up in Venice doing the West of Lincoln project. Here you have a community that's in the midst of being gentrified. And I know that good, well-intending people moving into a new area are being thoughtless about the people who created the area that they love so much. And when I look at Nevada County, I can say that that's probably like this authoritarian attitude that happens to a lot of people when they move to a new community. They think, oh, I'm going to come to this community, I'm going to make it so much better than it was. It's so cool, but it's going to be even cooler when I do this. Instead of taking the time to recognize that there's a culture that built that community prior to you moving, and before you settle in with change, settle in with an understanding and learning about the people who were there before you. And of course, we could have this conversation about taking it all the way back to settling in the United States. But so on that note, where did you come from prior to living in Nevada County, or where did you grow up? Actually, let's just say, where did you grow up? Mike, you grew up in the town of Washington. Next.
Yeah, I grew up all over the place, so it's always a hard question for me to answer because I want credit for like having lived all over the place. But yeah, my parents were not military, they were hippies, and they just moved and moved and moved. They were ski bunnies, they were travelers, and so before I moved to Nevada County, I'll say mostly California. So Oregon, Louisiana, with family on the East Coast. And before I moved here, I lived in Stockton. So a lot of diversity there. That was kind of a culture shock moving here. I didn't move here. I just moved here for the beauty and to get away from big city and back to the trees. So yeah, definitely that diversity is not as easy to find here, but yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I relate to that, Marnie.
Okay, hello.
It's vodka, right, Blanca?
Yeah, vodka. Yeah, I'm thinking about your question and wondering why I'm feeling a little bothered by it. And I'm not quite clear, except that I think that what we're talking about are very external differences in customs, rather than in our humanity. So I think if the question were posed differently, something about do we find that although we meet people of diverse backgrounds, different color, different language, don't we always find a common denominator in our humanity, that all those external attributes are just that. They're not really, we're really not different. And in my own experience, when I first came to America, my mother and my sister and I sought out the Croatian community in Los Angeles, thinking that we would associate with people who were similar to us. And I was brought up in communist Yugoslavia, and I came to an immigrant community that was extremely conservative. They were people who left because they hated communism. So their values were completely different than mine. And their world was very small. And I met there people who had lived in the United States for 50 years, but kept referring to this country as the foreign country. And I thought, something is wrong with this picture. These people have lived here for 50 years. They had children here. They married their children here, and they're still talking about their native land as the only place that they refer to as home. And it was only after I started to travel through Mexico and explore Native American cultures in this country that I found myself feeling completely at home, because I met people who were land-centered in Mexico, indigenous peoples that were so similar to my own grandparents, who lived in very so-called primitive peasant cultures in Yugoslavia. So once I discovered this similarity of people living in rhythm to the earth, I felt completely at home here, and I felt that the whole world was my home and that there were no differences.
Vladka, that is so amazing to like articulate the internal differences versus the external. I love that.
This is very good what you're doing. I'm so glad that I connected.
Thank you for speaking up. I really found a lot of value in your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah, Maria.
Being a white female, cisgendered, Christian, raised as a Christian, those kinds of things, I've always lived with the rather naive privilege that I didn't realize I had until many years into my life. However, I also was raised within a family that is infinitely curious and very open-minded, and didn't approach life from that closed box kind of place. And so, so I had the privilege of being able to be naive enough to think that we're all just the same. The external differences really are something that is, it benefits the status quo for us to focus on them. However, the reality is that it is something that has been very successfully weaponized by many cultures over eons. That that we're different. And so I don't know where I'm going with this other than I just really appreciate how you articulated that just now, Vladka, that it's stand up for those who are not, who don't have access to the same privileges. But it's an uncomfortable thing to be able to recognize in ourselves that, oh, I'm coming from a place of privilege, because that takes a level of being able to recognize the ways that maybe we haven't stood up for others in the past.
Sarah, this is also another important point about thinking about the segments of community that we may not have exposure to. Something that Juliet and I talked about earlier this year for home is people with accessibility issues. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it. Maria, any chance of hearing from you before we wrap up our session today? And
Good morning. Good morning. I grew up in Venice, west of Lincoln, and that's how I met you and, you know, got exposure to this. So for me, our community was diverse, you know, and I had that exposure growing up, diverse. But when you think about cultures, and I know somebody was talking about them being segregated, it's not necessarily that they're segregated, is that people cluster together. You know, they try to stay with their similar backgrounds because that's what's comfortable, that's what they're familiar with. And so growing up, you know, I had opportunities to be exposed to different cultures. Any opportunity I had to leave my home, I would. I'm a type 1 diabetic, so when I got diabetes in junior high and there was an opportunity to go to camp, I did that. You know, when I was in high school, you know, I got involved with Young Life, and I, you know, was able to get away and have more exposure than just Venice, just my home, and to get out and be amongst other people, maybe with different beliefs and things like that. I think now as a mother, part of our exposure for our child to other cultures is through food. Everybody needs to eat, but we're exploring the world through food. That's one of the things, you know, my daughter has this urge to travel, and I think it comes partly from that.
Yeah, I love that, because food is something that we all eat. That's something we all share in common, and food we actually do have access to, and it's relatively safe if you feel uncomfortable, right? Yeah, I love that. Well, I must say that Maria and I actually had a huge advantage growing up in Venice in terms of this discussion, because we grew up in a community that was very diverse. Often I feel like I didn't realize how diverse it was till I moved here. But then the boardwalk was literally a melting pot from every country in the world. So we had exposure to every language, and it was all within, you know, the couple mile radius. So it really was an advantage. But we are at our time here, and I want to share another slide on our way out here. We are in our third year, and while this is the end of Saturday Morning Question, I just wanted to touch very briefly on our home project.
Sure. Thanks, Ruth. Well, first I'd like to say that we've been very stimulated by our work with a fairly new organization, which is international, but it's based in California. And it was started by the executive director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art, Nina Simon. And she called and it started off as a program in which she examined her own organization, from how connected it was to the people that lived within the area she served, Santa Cruz. And by doing so, she quickly realized that her organization, though situated in a very diverse region, was barely touching the lives of those she served. So she called her organization Of, By, For All. And Nevada County Arts Council joined that organization in order to challenge ourselves. And had we not been in shelter of place or lockdown, we would have held a really wonderful event at this time of year. It would have been held in the Miners Foundry. We would have invited everyone sitting around this table to come and share their stories of what being a representative, if you like, of a less visible community among the larger community feels like, and how home has one sense, that's home, and what their senses of home are. We would have invited a wonderful representative from Of, By, For All to come and speak to us, the community, about what a field-tested, intentional framework to help build relationships, relevance, and impact looks like within rural Nevada County, teaching organizations how to be of, by, and for all their diverse communities. So we're going to hold this event. We're going to probably call it a Cultural Equity Convening. I don't know if Sue, our supervisor, one of our board of supervisors for the county, is still on the call. But Sue, I can see she's
still here.
Oh, Sue, hi, yay. So Sue is one of our participants this year, because for all and so is Juliet, who's with us. And Sue is going to open our day by telling a story, a really simple story about her own sense of home.
The insight and the collaboration from so many people has just been amazing, and I really have taken so much of it to heart and just so appreciate y'all. Really, like, watching our community battle has been so difficult. And I think what we're doing and what you're doing is how we build that community again.
And with that, there's just I really want to thank the CHIRP, California Heritage Indigenous Research Project, and Shelley and Ginger Covert for their participation, and also the California Arts Council, whom we couldn't do that without their funding. That I would just say for myself that taking the time to talk to somebody who's unfamiliar, and the simple asking of one question is it is a powerful act of community building, and of course, more importantly, listening, and really listening. The other thing I would say that I learned from West of Lincoln, and it really does relate to what Sue was saying, is that wherever you live, whatever community you live in, there are several generations of people who have created it to be exactly the way it is, with all its faults and all the reasons why you may have moved there. And that it is a first and a starting place to really understanding your community. Often we go to new communities to get a fresh start, to look at things differently. And we might show up thinking, what is it that I can give to this community, as opposed to maybe even looking at the community and thinking, what is it that the community is asking of me? Before we sign off and say goodbye, did anybody have a closing comment or a question or something you would like to add?
Great for reaching out to other artists and people. And I really don't want things like this to end. So where else is everybody reaching out and joining other communities maybe similar to this in the area? Like, is there anything else going on as well?
And I would say,
Great.
Shelby, on our webpage, under which is nevadacountyarts.org, if you go to, there's a special tab called Get Involved.
I was going to say, it starts with an introduction. So I, moved to an area called Wiseburn, and I know a lot of people in my community. And the way that I know that is that I've introduced myself and gotten to know the other person's name. And when I see them the next time, I refer to them by name, and I learn something each time I interact with them. I know it's challenging during this pandemic time, but that's what I would suggest if anybody wants to meet someone outside of their community, someone different, someone diverse. It all starts with a conversation and an introduction.
God, and that was giving me an idea of like, what businesses have I not been in because they don't, kind of what Michelle said, because they may not, their marketing might not attract me to the things that I'm typically interested in, and go in and say hi to the shop owner or the person working there. We are going to continue doing our work. I'm sure I'll be doing something with Eliza. I'm sure I'll be coming up with something new in the months to come. I'm going to wish everyone well and send my love. And I guess that's it for our Saturday morning question.
How about we end with a great big thank you and a bit of a cheer for Ruth. Ruth, you've been truly amazing. You know we all feel that. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Thank you, Ruth.
Likewise. Thank you. Thank you for putting me on the
Great
spot.
job, Ruth.
All right.
Get rid of